So as Herzl finished off talking about, Dr. Gerstein finished off talking about how research might lead to the new understanding of diabetes, I'll just quickly go over some of our basic understandings of why we think diabetes develops. As we talked about, glucose is really centrally involved with the development of diabetes, and we get glucose in the blood from what we eat as well as from the liver. And after we eat, we get insulin secretion from the pancreas, as we heard, and that causes the sugar to go into the muscle and the fat, while shutting down the sugar coming from the liver. And over the last 25 or 30 years, we've learned a great deal about how and why that process happens. And that's helped us develop some new therapies and trying to understand why diabetes develops. So we get our insulin released from the pancreas, and this then in turns on a whole series of molecules inside a cell. And this pathway has been studied extensively for the last 25 or 30 years since the initial cloning of this first step. This then causes this protein, glucose transporter 4, to come to the membrane in muscle and adipose tissue. And this causes the sugar to be sucked in to the muscle and the fat. And so this is why insulin lowers the blood sugar, by promoting the uptake of the sugar from the blood into the tissues. In the liver, what happens is a similar process where it shuts down the processing or the production of sugar from the liver. So ultimately what happens is that you get a very tight glucose control, and that the muscle and the fat suck up the glucose, and the insulin causes the glucose coming out of the liver to stop happening. But as we heard in diabetes, there's problems here. So the amount of insulin that you need to elicit that response that I showed you previously is no longer enough. And eventually the beta cells become fatigued or worn out, and due to many of the things that we heard about, and autoimmunity potentially being one of the causes, and other factors. Regardless, there's not enough insulin to bring down that sugar in the blood, or the blood glucose. So a key question from our aspects of understanding about diabetes is, I guess, what is the cause and why does it develop? And one of the things involves genetics. And what we've learned is that by understanding these molecules that are involved with the process of glucose regulation, in particular the insulin signaling pathway, is that there can be genetic defects in some of them. In particular, we know that there's genetic mutations in this protein called insulin receptor substrate 1, as well as this protein down here, TBC1D1, and this was discovered here at McMaster by David Meyer, who's here now. And ultimately, this can lead to an increased risk of type 2 diabetes by about 25 to 30%. These mutations appear to be present in about 5 to 10% of the population. So these are some of the most prevalent genetic polymorphisms within the insulin signaling cascade that might precipitate the development of diabetes. Obviously, this is not all-encompassing. It increases the risk slightly, and it's present in a small portion of the population that has diabetes. Clearly, there must be other factors, and this is where, of course, environmental factors come into play that we understand that contribute to the development of diabetes. And obviously, as we heard about, one of the most important factors might be increasing rates of obesity and inactivity in our population. And Dr. Gerstein discussed several of these earlier. I guess the most obvious one is the obesity change that has happened over the last 25 years, where we have much higher incidence of obesity, also in children, but also in adults. And in Ontario, it's interesting that there's greater than 1 million children in Ontario who are considered overweight, and 350,000 of these are obese. So if we think about the accelerated aging and the many of these children who are developing diabetes now, we can think that these kids are developing, pushing the curve much further out, where we'll see a lot of these aging diseases much earlier on. So why does obesity and inactivity promote the development of diabetes? And I guess there's two main theories. Obviously, there's a whole host of diseases that could, or factors that could contribute. I'll discuss, I guess, two of the most prevalent theories behind how environmental factors, which are promoted by obesity, can cause diabetes. The first being lipids. And in addition, in specifically what we're talking about is as you become more overweight, some people are able to store their fat better and some people are not. And as we heard, some of these fat cells can become full, and then we start getting fat stored in other tissues, such as your muscle and liver. And what we know is that these lipids stored within the muscle and the fat, these are different lipid species, can induce stress activation of a number of complicated molecules that can impair and exacerbate potential genetic defects in this pathway. So trying to figure out why lipid accumulates in things like muscle and liver instead of just the fat is really important for our understanding of why diabetes develops. And so I'll just show an overview here. Here we have fat circulating in the blood, and just like the sugar, and the fat's taken up. It can be synthesized into a stable form of lipids, such as a lipid droplet, triacylglycerol, or diacylglycerol. It's then broken down back into this molecule, fatty acid currency, and then it's burned in the mitochondria. Okay? So these are sort of the main steps in controlling how much fat we burn and why fat can accumulate in tissue, such as the liver and muscle, which in turn will prevent the insulin from working as well. So we showed that one of the key risk factors in type 2 diabetics is their muscle, is that there's much higher rates of fat input into the muscle. So the muscle is taking up much higher rates of fat. Another theory for why fat accumulates in muscle is that there's defects in these mitochondria, which are the key molecules that are burning the fat in the muscle and the liver. And this is some data from Jerry Schulman's lab, where they show in humans as well. This data is also from human muscle, where we show that insulin-resistant people have impaired glucose uptake into muscle, higher fat content, and impaired or lower levels of mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation, or reduced ability of the mitochondria to burn fat. Importantly, it's this lipid molecule, this diacylglycerol, which seems to be the key driver of this insulin resistance phenotype, and this is just shown here. When you look at the correlation between this lipid diacylglycerol and an insulin sensitivity index, where you see a really strong positive correlation in human subjects in the liver as well as in muscle. So one of the things that we think is contributing to the worsening of the development of diabetes is that we get this accumulation of fat within muscle and liver, and this in turn switches on many of these things which inhibit the ability of insulin to work properly. Another thing that many people are very interested in is the role that inflammation plays. And we think about inflammation when we have a bacterial infection or something like that. But what we are appreciating more and more is that with being overweight or inactivity, we get a state of low-grade inflammation in all our tissues. And this doesn't just happen in fat, but this is where we spend a lot of our time looking at. And so this interconnection between lipids and inflammation is very, very interesting, because there's a lot of overlap between these things. And they can induce very similar pathways, which can impair the ability of insulin to stimulate glucose uptake and shut down glucose coming from the liver. And so we focused on a number of these molecules, but this isn't really important to the story here because we found out these weren't really very good targets. But what we're focusing on now is many of these is why immune cells accumulate in fat as well as liver and muscle. So your immune cells are your intracellular sensors of damage, and they're patrolling your body all the time looking for bad things going on. What we know is when the fat cell grows, you get more of these immune cells accumulating in adipose tissue, but also the liver and the muscle. And these immune cells then secrete a number of inflammatory factors. And these inflammatory factors can cause insulin resistance and diabetes, as I talked to. One of the reasons why we think these immune factors or these inflammatory factors are increased is because it's not only the fat cell in the liver or the muscle that gets more fat in it, it's also the immune cells that start to accumulate more fat. And this is just shown here when we look at staining of immune cells for the amount of fat within them. It's it goes much higher with obesity, or if you feed an animal a high-fat diet. So why does that happen? Well, this is just some data from our lab showing that immune cells, just like muscle and liver, have mitochondria in them. And these are the essential organ that's required for the burning of fat. And we find that if you lower the amount of mitochondria in the immune cell by deleting specific proteins, what you get is lower rates of fat burning, higher lipid accumulation, and that this can drive the development of inflammation in immune cells. So it's really very similar to what we saw in the muscle and the liver, where this interplay between inflammation and lipid is occurring, where we get increased inflammation, and this is directly correlated to the amount of mitochondria in our immune cells. And importantly, what we find is that if with this inflammation, this drives the development of higher blood sugar, higher insulin levels, and an impaired ability of insulin to lower blood sugar. And this is in mice, but there's also data in humans suggesting that with anti-inflammation therapies that there might be some protective effects and improvements in the ability of insulin to lower blood sugar. So in summary, in the last just couple of minutes, I guess we've discussed how polymorphisms in some populations, in some people, can contribute in some ways to defects in the ability of insulin to work, to increase glucose uptake and shut down glucose production. But it's lipids can have additive effects on these genetic predisposition to really impair this insulin signaling pathway. And it's this lipids in combination in immune cells which can really push the process even further, so that you have lipids and inflammation driving the development of diabetes and the inability of insulin to work. So we think of diabetes as a disease of sugar metabolism or defects in sugar metabolism. But what we think really is going on is that probably one of the earlier events is a defect in lipid metabolism, which then precedes the development of these glucose abnormalities that ultimately end up in diabetes. So this is just in summary of what we think is going on and why does type 2 diabetes develop. Clearly genetics plays a role, and then we have environmental factors such as lipids and inflammation, which may also contribute. So one of the things we're interested in is how these type 2 diabetes medications can prevent these effects, and by potentially interacting and reducing the amount of lipids and inflammation within muscle and liver, the key organs for controlling blood sugar. And that's all. I'll just end there. So thank you.